so much for finding your way. We are doing a series on the American Revolution. It's kind of an extended footnote of a series we did some years back on church history. So this is a little kind of extended detail of one part of that, which has to do with the connections between the Protestant Reformation that had taken place a couple of hundred years earlier, you know, and the extended consequence of it, which eventually leads to the story of what took place here. So last time we were together, which was 2 weeks ago, we were looking at what I call three waves of Calvinists. All of these that were coming, that we're interested in, tended to be Calvinistic, and they were the dominant population, not exclusively. There were others here, of course, but in the major population centers in New England, eventually, of course, became very important, and in Pennsylvania, and eventually in North Carolina. You would say that in many ways it was these Calvinists who really kind of set the agenda. Obviously, as time went on and as generations came one past another, some of that changed a bit over time, but nevertheless, this was sort of the fundamental impulse that we're interested in. The first of those waves were the Puritans that came from England, established Massachusetts Bay. The second of them were Scots, just after the killing times in Scotland, as they're called, who wound up more or less in Pennsylvania, founded in 1680 by William Penn, a Quaker, but he established a policy of religious tolerance, which was an open invitation to others who felt beleaguered. And those Scots who had just been through that rough time there felt that was a good place to go. And then 40 years later, in 1720, again, another wave. These were Scots-Irish for the most part. They also came to Pennsylvania. The people that showed up the second wave were in a little bit of a tension with those who had come earlier. And it gave rise to a conflict between what was called the New Side and Old Side Presbyterians. That was a term used at the time. The New Lights and the Old Lights was another way it was described. And so that created a bit of the tension that forms part of the drama that we're interested in. Some of those who were in Pennsylvania migrated south, but that was some years later when they wound up then in North Carolina, Charlottesville, Mecklenburg County, and we'll be getting to that story one of these days, not today so much, but eventually. So that's kind of the lay of the land. I'd like to have us think about a biblical text once again as we get going. I appreciated John highlighting this verse, or at least this idea, in his sermon, because it does play a role in our discussion this morning as well. It's Paul's writing to the Corinthians, chapter 1, which he's trying to establish kind of a thesis for his book. And he says something remarkable at chapter 1, verse 18, concerning the power of the gospel. So this is the word of God. The preaching of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness, but to us who are being saved by it, it is the power of God unto salvation. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. This was an idea that was very much in the heart of the preaching that began to be a dominant force in the colonies during this time frame. And so I want to keep that in mind as we go along. But before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Our Father, we're grateful to you that you have called us to this place, called us to this church, to this fellowship, to all of its ministries, to its testimony in this community. We thank you that we stand in a long line of Presbyterian churches and people who've been faithful through the ages, and that we can join together with them in an ongoing narrative of how you, in fact, are accomplishing your purposes to the great end of the glory of Christ. And for all of that, we give you thanks, asking these things in his name. Amen. All right, well, you have to ask the question. You've got what are going to be three separate population centers, and other people as well, scattered through the colonies. Of course, others are coming now for various reasons at various times. We have these kind of dominant populations, but others show up. And what was it that was going to galvanize them? What would make people living in Virginia identify with people living in New York. That didn't come natively necessarily. They were pretty much citizens of their individual states, and that sense of a broader kind of political arrangement wasn't the first thing on most people's minds. Scholars who've looked at this, not necessarily Christian scholars, not people who have some kind of biblical axe to grind, but just those who've looked at it soberly, have reached a conclusion that is shared by many, that the one galvanizing impact, the thing that really began to pull the colonial sense of an identity together, was something that broke out in 1740 and continued for some 10 years and is commonly called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, which all of a sudden begins to give people a sense that they're part of something bigger, you see. And so I will be talking about that in a couple of weeks in some detail, but for now I just want to do a little bit of what I'm calling precursors to the Great Awakening. We're looking really at the decade now of the 1730s and asking who were some of those that came before who didn't have quite the impact of George Whitefield, who became the most dominant, by far the most dominant personality of the Great Awakening. But who were those who came somewhat before, but you might say prepared the way in some ways for this? And so that's what I'd like to do this morning. So we're going to be looking at several names. You may be familiar with some of them, maybe not others, but the point is these are people who certainly had an impact at the time, and probably we would say were more or less, they didn't know it necessarily, preparing for this great moment of transformation that really occurred in connection with the Great Awakening. So the first of these is a fellow we talked about last time. His name is William Tennant. William Tennant was, of course, an Scots-Irish Presbyterian. We talked about him, but of course life in Ireland had become a little bit challenging. The Scots-Irish were prevented from holding public offices. They were prevented from going to institutions of higher learning. They were prevented from having teaching posts in Ireland. They were feeling more or less frozen out, and many began to make the trip around 1720, before and after, to Pennsylvania because it had a welcome mat out there. It's always nice, Founded by a Quaker. Quakers believed in religious tolerance. This was one of the most tolerant places in the world you could go. Depending on your religious convictions, you could go and have a kind of safe harbor there. And so some of these people were coming from Ireland, these Scots-Irish who'd been there for a generation or so, in order to finally find a little bit of religious relief from the pressure that they'd been feeling there in Ireland. As it turns out, William Tennant and his teenage son Gilbert showed up in 1718, but they were part of a much larger population that came about the same time. There were not just Scots-Irish at this point. There were many coming from many quarters in Europe who were also seeking a little bit of reprieve from some of the pressures they were feeling in Europe. So you had Reformed Germans. These are Calvinists in Germany who didn't go with the Lutheran Church, a minority, but they were more followers of Calvin. You had Swedish Reformed people. The Dutch Reformed, of course, were important. And so all of these are coming along, but probably the dominant population that showed up at the time would be these who were part of the Scots-Irish. And so they show up at this point, and they settle in to the middle colonies. They settle into Pennsylvania, and they are going to there hopefully have a good welcome among other Presbyterians who've been there, have actually become somewhat dominant through the years in their participation in life there. But what happens is they begin to be aware that there's a difference, between the Presbyterians who've been there for a while, who've become successful, who've had some success in business and other enterprises. They've begun to have a more comfortable life. I'm going to call them, I don't mean to be disparaging here, but I'm going to call these the comfortable Presbyterians, all right? They'd been there for a while. Life was treating them pretty well. These are the Ben Franklins of the world, the more famous of them, but there were many, many others who were kind of enjoying the fruits of being in this place where, the climate was good and various forces did kind of redound to their benefit. And now come people fresh from persecution, fresh from hard times, and they just couldn't quite get used to this comfortable Presbyterian culture. William Tennant, for example, put a heavy emphasis on faith. Faith is something God does to you and you know it. That's the kind of thing William Tennant would say. Faith is not something you just gin up. It's not just a good attitude. You know, the comfortable Presbyterians thought, well, hey, you drive the speed limit, you pay your taxes, you're a decent citizen, you got faith. It's sort of just a cultural thing. And now William Tennant comes and he's driving home. There has to be new birth. This was called the New Birth movement in some quarters, really emphasizing a drama connected to conversion that seemed to be lost on these more secure, comfortable Presbyterians who'd been there. William Tennant fought that battle for a while, but he was kind of in a losing position and eventually decided the only way out of this would be to establish a school which would in fact become a school training people in the new side, this kind of new view, as it were, vis-a-vis what was already there. And that, of course, came to be called the Log College. We introduced this last time. It became eventually the College of New Jersey, which eventually became Princeton. And so this Log College, very humble in its beginnings, of course, had quite a prestigious history by the time we get up to the present day. I gave you this quote last time from Ben Franklin, but I like Ben Franklin so much I'm going to throw it at you again. And here it is. Ben Franklin, writing of the Log College, with which he was quite familiar, he says, quote, "It seemed to me to resemble the school of the old prophets, the old school of the prophets in the Old Testament. For their habitations were mean, they were humble, and yet," he says, "from this despised place 7 or 8 worthy ministers of Jesus have lately been sent forth, among them Gilbert, who gained license to preach in New Jersey." And this brings me to the second then of these precursors of the Great Awakening, who is Gilbert Tennant, who is in fact the son of William. Came as a teenager. Now as he gets a little older, he begins to develop a ministry of his own. Notice he's born in 1703. All of the precursors I'm referring to here were born in the same decade. The first decade of the 1700s, this is the first of them. He was a firm, outspoken, aggressive Calvinist. I know some people think you can't be an evangelist and a Calvinist. Personally, I'm going to not try to develop this. I don't think you can be a true evangelist unless you're a Calvinist. That, to me, seems to follow naturally, but we'll save that for another time, or if you want to talk about it later. But anyway, he was an evangelistic Calvinist on steroids. I mean, he preached and everything sizzled. He was that kind of guy, much more aggressive in the pulpit even than his father had been. And he stood for the idea I was suggesting to you earlier from Paul, that the power of God is unleashed in preaching. He believed that we're not simply persuading people. When we preach, we are unleashing a power that comes from heaven itself to change people supernaturally through this medium of the preached word. That sermons are not simply academic lectures intended to sort of persuade you or inform you or instruct you a little bit, you know, adjust your thinking slightly. That something vastly more profound happens in preaching. They are not simply informative, they are performative. And so he was really preaching along those lines. He was a graduate, one of the earliest of this Log College, was treated to all kinds of contempt from coming from such a humble beginning, and so he had to defend the Log College. He shot back saying these comfortable Presbyterians were Gentile Pharisees, and much, much stronger language for sure. But this is Sunday school, so I'm just going to keep it kind of safe and, leave it at that. But you can imagine that he had a quite ferocious attitude in his preaching. I mentioned J.D. Dickey to you, who I'm going to be relying on, among others, as we go along, but he said of Gilbert, quote, "Gilbert was certain that no person became a true believer without first experiencing the terror of sin." You didn't just kind of comfortably morph into being a decent Christian person. No, there was something more dramatic going on, and he was really committed to that. You have to have this searching of the soul and the resulting realization that one is not a Christian. That's what conversion requires. He sort of raised what's sometimes called hellfire preaching among the Puritans to a fine art. I'm just going to tell you that. If you've ever heard that expression, Puritan hellfire preachers. This is Exhibit A. This is the way this guy preached. And if he were to walk in here and preach to us, we would just have a sanctuary full of grease spots. I mean, that's kind of the way that he went about it. His most famous sermon, which was later published and circulated widely, this was in 1735, was entitled "A Solemn Warning to the Secure World from the God of Terrible Majesty." And it was just an amazing display of this kind of highly powerful, convicting sermonizing. When he was told that, man, you're going too far, you're pushing too hard, you got to back down a little bit. He didn't back down, he doubled down, it just made him become all the more aggressive in the way that he was doing this. Now, the problem he had was, it had never occurred to him you could preach anywhere except in a church. You can't preach anywhere else. And so, as it turns out, as pulpits and pastors who governed them became aware of the style of Gilbert, he tended to be frozen out of the larger cities anywhere. Now, he could preach in rural areas, but that did limit, in a sense, the impact that he was able to have. And so, because he was kept out of those larger cities, his influence was probably limited somewhat by that. His written sermons, of course, got a fair amount of circulation, but it's not quite the same to read a sermon as to hear it, and so that was going on, but I would call him a precursor to the Great Awakening. Things changed dramatically when George Whitefield showed up, and we'll take a look at that next week, but for now, just bear in mind, he's active, but again, he's sort of limited in the effect that he can have. So that's what's happening in Pennsylvania. The new side, old side conflict is probably the main story. Later, there's going to be a branch of these Pennsylvania Presbyterians who migrate south into North Carolina and set up shop in a place called Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. And they become an extremely important part of our story, but we're not quite there yet. So I'm just leaving that aside for the moment. But be aware, we'll have that third center down there in North Carolina coming. All right, the next of our precursors is one you are familiar with, Jonathan Edwards, grandson of Solomon Stoddard, son of Esther Stoddard, so it was his maternal grandfather. He was brilliant, of course. He was the associate pastor of the Northampton church in New England. Solomon Stoddard was sometimes called the Pope of the Connecticut Valley. That was tongue-in-cheek, of course, but he had such influence that it was almost as if he were the Pope of those Puritans or their descendants there in New England. He had a huge dominating role to play. He was a powerful preacher, one of my heroes personally, even though, as I told you a little bit a couple of weeks ago, he did fudge just a bit in what's called the halfway covenant. So I talked about that just a bit at that time. But he was a wonderful minister and a powerful preacher. But he died in 1729, and the associate pastor, who was Jonathan, his grandson, became the pastor. For 1729, Jonathan Edwards becomes the pastor of the Northampton church, the most premier church, congregational church there in New England. He held that post for about 20 years. Jonathan Edwards was brilliant, but if you read his early writings as he was now becoming a pastor of this major church, you would be amazed at the tone of his writing, because he seriously lamented what he called the debauchery of New England. Now, we would probably think by modern standards, you ain't seen debauchery, but by the standards of the day, in terms of what he knew was the great heritage, Massachusetts Bay, City on a Hill, John Winthrop, all of that early impulse of those Puritans who had showed up 100 years before, he felt that things had descended to such an extent that he could only weep over what he saw as the present moral condition of life in New England. And he spoke openly about it, and he preached openly about it. So there was no question as to his views of that particular aspect of life. He was aware, however, that from time to time there were what he called revivals or awakenings. The term revival is actually kind of a later thing, a later term, but something like that, you know what I mean, where there'd be a kind of a moment of sort of an unexpected reaction to the preaching that spread more than you would have anticipated, where people sort of are touched so deeply that it becomes an evident phenomenon, a revival, you know. And he was aware that some of that had happened even under Solomon Stoddard's preaching. From time to time, for no reason you could really attribute to any particular cause, there'd be this revival. Even Jonathan Edwards himself had seen a little bit of it. And by the way, I mentioned hellfire preachers, and most people think Jonathan Edwards was one of them. So for whatever it's worth, I hope I can disabuse you of that. He rarely, if ever, mentioned the word hell in a sermon. The most famous sermon he preached, certainly he did mention it, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But if you read that sermon carefully, you'll see it's not a sermon on hell, it's a sermon on hands. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, and the angry God happens to be a merciful God as well. The thesis of the sermon was that because of our sinfulness, God could at any time remove the supports of his merciful hands and let us drop into the wrath we richly deserve, you see. So now is the time to repent. That was the force of the sermon. It wasn't this grotesque description of how bad it is in hell, which some people sort of casually assumed that was what Edwards was doing. But Edwards himself much more often preached on other topics. That was certainly present there, but it wasn't a major theme. Edwards had a high, somewhat thin voice. He wasn't a bombastic, loud preacher. He was nearsighted. He read those masterpiece sermons from a script, from a transcript, and because he was nearsighted, he had to hold them right up to his face and read them, and that was the way he preached for about an hour and a half at a time, you know. Now, you would think people would go to sleep, but he was so brilliant in his thoughts that they actually listened to him kind of on the edge of their seats, but he was not the same style as I was mentioning in connection with Gilbert. But he had seen some revivals. Even Jonathan Edwards, with that particular style, had nevertheless seen occasions when there had been something of a kind of outbreak. In fact, Edwards was so impressed with these that he actually wrote a book that you may have come across at some point. It's called A Faithful Narrative of Surprising Conversions. The actual original title is about 4 lines long, but it's been shortened up, you know. So now it's called A Narrative of Surprising Conversions. Still readily available. Go home this afternoon, jump on Amazon, you'll have it by the end of the week. It's well worth reading, in which he talks about surprising conversions in some of these revivals. I don't know about you, I've sometimes looked at people, and against my better instincts, I'll say, you know, I don't think that person could ever become a Christian. You ever said something like that? You've seen somebody that's so just... Well, I just won't even try to describe it, you know? But you're just like, how could that person ever come to faith? How could it happen? And yet, I tell you, in history, there have been some of the most remarkable evangelists were people who were just those people. You know, that's true, isn't it? C.S. Lewis was once a hardened atheist. Before, of course, the grace of God ran him down, and then he became one of the great apologists for the Christian faith of the 20th century. So anyway, this is a great book that sort of narrates a little bit of that, and it's well worth reading. But even at that, he still lamented that generally speaking, the culture of New England that Jonathan Edwards was familiar with was really not a paragon of what he considered to be the kind of Christian virtue he would have liked to see. So that was Edwards about 1729 or so. Notice that Jonathan Edwards is also born the same year as Gilbert Tennant, so 1703 for both of them. Another character I want to mention to you is named Alexander Craighead. He's born 1707, so just a couple of years later. You may or may not know his name. He was quite famous at the time. He arrived as a boy in Pennsylvania in about 1715. His father was a Scot-Irish Presbyterian pastor who had a long and very warm memory of Richard Cameron. We talked about a few weeks ago, the Lion of the Covenant, the Cameronian revolt there in Scotland and all of that. Well, he was very much a follower of Cameron and very much devoted to that covenant that had been made famous at the time of Richard Cameron. Well, the son followed very much in the footsteps of his father and believed that true Presbyterians, especially of a Scot extraction, should hold in high esteem people like Richard Cameron, that great Scot who had been a champion of religious freedom there in Scotland in those days. Later, Craighead himself said, true Presbyterians have frequently been termed Cameronians, who continued steadfast in their faith. So he came over as a boy with his father. At age 28, Alexander Craighead became the pastor of the Middle Octarara Church, which is in Quarryville, Pennsylvania, and exists to this day. Okay? So that's a PCUSA church in Octarara, Pennsylvania. It's about 80 miles to the west of Philadelphia. He couldn't get a church in Philadelphia. This is kind of a more rural setting at the time, but just like Gilbert, the hearing for someone like Alexander Craighead was more or less limited. And so he found this church here and became its pastor and was the pastor there for a little over 10 years. Now just note to self, kind of tuck this away, we're going to treat him again later because he is the one who basically leads the migration of Scot-Irish out of Pennsylvania down to Mecklenburg County. And so that makes him a very important character in our story, but we're not quite there yet. That's more in the late 40s, and we're still looking at the 30s right now. But a couple of things about this fellow that are interesting. Jonathan Edwards had hinted that part of the debauchery in New England was the fault of the English. He thought the English kept exporting from England and importing into New England bad influences, and that was part of what was causing a sort of decay of the Christian culture there. And he made no bones about it. He spoke on those issues in his sermons. Some have seen in Jonathan Edwards maybe even the beginnings, the seeds of what became the revolutionary impulse later. He was not a revolutionary. I'm not going that far. He died before it ever happened, but you do see a little bit of that. Alexander Craighead, probably even more, incorporated a bit of an anti-English bite into his sermons. So he was not only a precursor to the Great Awakening, but maybe more importantly, a precursor to the Revolutionary War. Again, he didn't live to see it, but he does introduce in his sermons somewhat overtly and noticeably that bias against the English that did get into the bloodstream of some of those who heard him. Not everybody liked that. One disapproving pastor said of Craighead in particular, but generally of these New Light preachers, that they were the foremost in propagating principles of sedition. You see, that's interesting. He's saying the sermons are seditious because they're taking a critical attitude toward England. That's the sense of this. And disobedience to authority. I make no doubt, but it had an unhappy influence among the people and encouraged many to despise government and to speak evil of dignities. Well, that became the debate later in the run-up to the Revolutionary era, because there were people who said, you shouldn't revolt, you shouldn't do that, and that was a lively debate. And you might say the very beginning of it is clear back here in the 30s now, with somebody like Alexander Craighead. I might mention to you, this is show and tell, but I just couldn't resist bringing a book just to show you. This is volume 1 of 2 volumes that I have proudly displayed at home. You want to drop by and see it sometime, right there on my shelf. Political Sermons of the American Founding Era, beginning 1730. You read the first of these and you'll find that virtually every political sermon preached in that early era was preached by a Presbyterian. And Craighead, of course, is prominent among them, but there were many others. So part of the reason I'm doing this series, whether you like the general thesis of it or not, just as a matter of historical interest, we should be aware that we were kind of the first people to start beating the drum for questioning the way the authority of the English were exercising that authority among us. And so this is really kind of where that began. All right. Others have written on the impact of Alexander Craighead. I mentioned to you already Scott Seifert, a lawyer who wrote a really wonderful book. It's again worth reading, called The First American Declaration of Independence, called the Mecklenburg Declaration, preceding Jefferson's by about a year. Another that treats the same topic, coming a few years earlier, Charlotte and the American Revolution. If you can't quite read that subtitle there, it says, Reverend Alexander Craighead, the Mecklenburg Declaration, and the Foothills Fight for Independence. In other words, this is a pretty well documented aspect of the story, and this is at least part of what we want to make sure we think about as we go along. My next precursor is going to surprise you. This has Ben Franklin, you know, and we don't usually think of him as a great champion of the Great Awakening, but he actually was. But I'm giving him to you here as a kind of a counterexample. You notice the dates these people. Gilbert was born in 1703, Edwards in 1703, Craighead 1707, Ben Franklin right in the middle, 1706. He was the epitome of what I'm calling the comfortable Presbyterian. He was a brilliant scientist. I love Ben Franklin. So please don't think anything I'm saying at this point is intended to be disparaging, and especially in later weeks we'll see that. But at this point in his mid-20s, he was what you'd call a kind of rationalist Presbyterian, you know? He liked sweet reason. And this business about Jesus dying and forgiveness of sins, and I don't know about that. He just liked kind of the appeal to live a good life. And that showed up in Poor Richard's Almanac, and it was really peppered through his whole view. And he had a deep appreciation for that kind of Presbyterian tradition and that Puritan ethic and so on. And he celebrated it rather lavishly in his writings. His favorite pastor in Philadelphia in these years, we're in the 1730s now, he's in his 20s, was a fellow by the name of Samuel Hemphill. Samuel Hemphill was a rationalist Presbyterian, you see. He just preached sermons on how we should be good. And we should be good, you know. But that was about as far as it went. Ben Franklin loved the guy. This was his kind of preaching. He says in private notes describing Samuel Hemphill, quote, delivered with a good voice, apparently extemporaneously, most excellent discourses. He loved the guy. I became one of his constant hearers, his sermons pleasing me, says Franklin, as they had little of that dogmatical kind. Don't want that. Dogmatical sermons, good heavens, you know. Just preach, be nice, be good, and that's what he did. But inculcating strongly the practice of virtue, or what in the religious style are called good works. This was a guy that preached how we should live good lives, and that's what makes us good Presbyterians, and that's what Ben Franklin liked. Therefore, Ben Franklin was somewhat appalled when even the old school Presbyterians finally said, Samuel Hemphill, you've gone too far. They held a heresy trial and booted him. And Ben Franklin was really upset, and as a result of that, his comment on the event found its way into the Philadelphia Gazette in a little ditty that he wrote. Now, I'm giving this to you because he's one of our founding fathers, and we should pay attention to our founding fathers. In this quote, he mentions our authors. Our authors refers to the Presbyterian brass that had kicked out Samuel Hemphill. Here it is. Asses are grave and dull animals. Our authors are grave and dull animals. Therefore, our authors are grave, dull, or if you will, reverend asses. So, you know, it's Ben Franklin. I mean, what can you say? There he is. All right. I mention him not because he's a guy who's necessarily tilling the soil in anticipation of the Great Awakening, but it is interesting that the Great Awakening would have looked very much different had it not been for Ben Franklin. He became probably the single most important promulgator of the preaching through printed form of the sermons of the Great Awakening, especially of George Whitefield. He loved George Whitefield, and it is surprising because he also loved Samuel Hemphill, you see, so that was kind of a reversal of Franklin's own disposition. I'm going to save comment on that for a later time, but there was an early Franklin and a later Franklin, and you wouldn't quite notice that they were the same guy. He really did have a rather striking change over the years. The oldest, of course, of our founding fathers. Well, this brings me to George Whitefield. I don't want to do any bio on him. We'll do a little bit more of a biographical sketch beginning next week, but just kind of a thematic introduction to this character, George Whitefield. This is one of many paintings of Whitefield, and if you look closely, you'll notice that he appears to be cross-eyed. You see that? You see that there? And that's because he was. And he always wanted that to be depicted in his portraits. He didn't want to try to cover that up, and most do faithfully reflect that. He had one lazy eye. In other words, it just didn't track with the other one, you know. Whitefield was not only not embarrassed about that, he made good use of it. He was a what would you say, a dramatist of remarkable talent. He was a humorist. You know, he could hammer people into the kingdom or humor them into the kingdom, but one way or another, he was a preacher who used every means at his disposal to reach people through preaching, and he was a master of the art. The joke that went around about his eyes probably came from Whitefield himself, as he had one eye on God and the other eye on the devil, you know, and that's the way he preached, and that's the way he kind of thought about things. And so that was really an amazing aspect of him, just his kind of humility. And that was maybe as much as anything we'd think about if we just met the man, we'd just be astonished at his humility, to be so famous and so influential. He's commonly called America's preacher. Certainly at the time, that was a standard phrase used to describe him. He started preaching in earnest in the colonies about 1740, preached nonstop in the colonies and elsewhere for 30 years. He died right around 1770. During that time, he was nothing less than a preaching machine, preaching probably an average of 1,000 sermons a year. Now, if you do the arithmetic, that means an average about 3 sermons a day. But then if you allow that sometimes he had to travel, it might just be 1 sermon on that day and then 6 sermons the next day. The guy never prepared. He just preached. How do you do that? I spent hours preparing one, 30-minute lecture. He was giving these things all day long, every day. I don't know how in the world he pulled it off, but he was an amazing guy. He went back and forth across the Atlantic. These are one-way trips, 13 times over his career. You notice the odd number suggests he wound up in the colonies, which is indeed the case. He died here, really owned by the colonists as their favorite preacher. He died a widely beloved. Ben Franklin himself spoke fervently and deeply, with deep affection, at his service, along with many others at the time. He preached to thousands. The innovation of George Whitefield, which really never apparently occurred to Gilbert Tennant, was you could preach outside. Some had thought you can only preach in sacred precincts, sanctuaries and so on. If the church wouldn't let George Whitefield preach, which many didn't, he was very controversial, especially at the beginning. He was an Anglican priest to the day he died, and the Anglican church hated him. He virtually never made it into an Anglican church, but many others wouldn't let him in either. And if he couldn't preach inside, he'd just go outside. Go to the public park, go to the town square. The law has a phrase, open public forum. Well, that's where he went. He went there and he'd just stand on a soapbox and start preaching. He'd get on the back of a wagon. He preached in cemeteries. He preached in cornfields. You name it. If he could gather a crowd, he'd start preaching. And sometimes he would preach literally to thousands. There was a rumor that Ben Franklin heard that George Whitefield preached to over 20,000 people in Hyde Park in London. Ben Franklin didn't believe that could be the case, and of course Franklin, the scientist, decided to do an experiment to test that hypothesis. This description is in Franklin's autobiography, but it's being summarized by a historian, so this is how it reads. Well, listening to Franklin at the Philadelphia courthouse, Franklin walked away towards his shop in Market Street until he could no longer hear Whitefield distinctly. So you get Whitefield's preaching. Franklin starts walking away. Then he estimated his distance from Whitefield and calculated the area of a semicircle centered on Whitefield. Allowing 2 square feet per person, he computed that Whitefield could be heard by over 30,000 people in open air. The guy had tonsils, you know. I mean, he was naturally gifted. You know, some people just have a booming voice, and he had one to remember. And but not only that, but the dramatic flair and all of that. I mean, even if you were hearing George Whitefield at some distance, you were still feeling like you were a lot closer to the man than you actually were. It has been argued with some degree of force in scholarly circles. This hasn't really trickled down much to the popular level, but I tell you the scholarly work in this has really been remarkable. That probably if you had to say what was the one central catalyst for the American Revolution, it would be the outspoken Calvinist George Whitefield. He was a Calvinist, and he made no bones about it. I said early on, I tried to shock you a little bit, that Calvin could be said to be the inventor of the United States. Well, it sort of focused in through Whitefield like a laser beam. You know, he was the guy that brought it home in the colonies and preached up and down the seaboard these wonderful sermons that really had a powerful impact. Over time, he overtly, openly, and quite obviously threw his support to the American cause. Harry Stout was a longtime professor of history at Yale University. He was an expert on the American Revolutionary era, wrote many books on it, one of which was a biography of George Whitefield, in which he says, the book itself is The Divine Dramatist, if you want to read it, but he says this in his book, the opening of the book. As tensions between England and America grew, Whitefield saw he might have to choose. He was preaching in the colonies. He was aware, of course, of what he viewed as English abuses, especially of his own Anglican church. He was aware of it, and he was aware that he was going to have to, go on one side or the other of this fence. John Wesley, preaching at the same time in England, would remain loyal to England. John Wesley famously did not accept the American Revolution. He accepted the outcome, but he never thought it was legitimate. Whitefield could not do that. His institutional attachments and personal identification with the colonies were stronger than his loyalty to the crown. And so he chose. And his sermons increasing, not at the beginning so much, but over time. You see, over that 30 years, he died in 1770. Just 6 years before the Revolutionary War. Increasingly over time, his sermons became more and more political and more the kind of thing that would be fodder for a mentality of separation. And if anything, while he's not the only one by any means, and we'll talk about others, I would say that probably of all those who were really kind of a catalyst for this changing mood in the colonies, you might say Whitefield is at the top of the list. It's been estimated conservatively that 80% of people living in the colonies heard Whitefield preach at least once. Many of them heard him preach many times, and that influence by itself. Everybody knew who he was. He was the most famous guy. In fact, again, Stout says, Whitefield can justly be styled America's first cultural hero. Before Whitefield, there was no unifying intercolonial person or event. Indeed, before Whitefield, it's doubtful any name other than royalty was known equally from Boston to Charlottesville. But by 1750, now remember, he started in 1740, so by 10 years later, virtually every American loved and admired Whitefield and saw him as their champion. What did he do? He did what I was trying to argue to you earlier. He sort of galvanized that Calvinistic idea that we were born in a situation of equality and liberty. That's a Calvinistic idea. It was really unprecedented until Calvin, except you find it in the New Testament, But Whitefield was the one who championed that, beat that drum in a really powerful way in his sermons, and thus that vision of liberty became a very important part of what he was about. All right. I mentioned J.D. Dickey. He wrote a rather critical review. His book, American Demagogue, kind of gives away the game. He doesn't like Whitefield that much, but he is fair. He's a good historian. He spins his interpretation of the facts a bit, But in terms of reporting the facts, he's quite good. So I want to give you a somewhat extended quote here from Dickey to wrap up. We're about done in connection with what he says about George Whitefield. The most surprising result of the revival, however, was what it did to Americans' view of the British. The aftermath of the Great Awakening, what came after, let's say, 1750s and later, the later lives of the revivalists, Whitefield and others, who were all participants in it, the early crusade against slavery. I think you know that in the pre-revolutionary era, slavery was one of the most controversial issues up for grabs. And consistently, the most vicious attackers of the institution of slavery were people touched by the Great Awakening. That can be documented pretty easily. It's ironic because Whitefield himself never condemned it, in fact, kind of endorsed it. That's the biggest black eye in his reputation, is that he never openly repudiated slavery. We'll talk about the nuances of that at a later time, but the point is the champions of abolition in the Revolutionary era were, generally speaking, almost universally products of the Great Awakening. Characters like Charles Chauncey, Jonathan Mayhew, these are liberal preachers. They are rationalist preachers. They're sort of like the fellow I mentioned earlier, Hemphill. You know, they were not classical Puritans or Presbyterians, either one. That's the remarkable thing, is even they transformed from opponents of the Great Awakening into firebrands against imperial rule, uniting even their former evangelical enemies in a campaign for religious liberty and colonial rights. If you don't grab the point there, it's just simply that even these people who were enemies of the Great Awakening were so influenced by it that they themselves became champions of a revolutionary spirit. So you might say that across denominational lines and even across theological lines, by the end of this era, you have a pretty unanimous view that there had to be some kind of overt action to separate us from what were perceived as the abuses of the English. This Black Regiment, you've heard of them. They were basically clergy at the time, supporting the revolution. The Black Regiment of clergymen provided godly sanction for revolutionary activities. They produced some of the most vehement anti-imperial sermons American colonists had ever heard. They bridged the gap from the sectarian battles of the revival and nationalist resistance to the mother country. Here Dickey says, these ideas make some of us uncomfortable in the modern age. The notion that the United States didn't just evolve out of genteel philosophies of Western Europe, but also out of uneducated, homegrown wildcat evangelism seems vaguely unacceptable, you know. A breach of decorum, an uncomfortable assertion. I think even J.D. Dickey himself is a little bit uncomfortable reporting that to us, which is why he puts it there. But he grants scholarly research on the topic over the last half century has proved to be convincing. Ever since Alan Heimert's monumental 1966 study, Religion and the American Mind, this was a groundbreaking work that changed the whole scholarly opinion of what took place during the Revolutionary era, an extremely important work by a very competent scholar, Alan Heimert, have begun to appreciate how much the creation of an independent America owes to the religious upheaval. He did not innovate this, it was already going on. At Harvard University in the 1940s, there was a scholar named Perry Miller. Some of you know his name. Perry Miller was a professor of American literature, born in 1905, died in 1958. He was a dominant personality. He sort of tripped across the Puritans. I think that's the way you'd put it. As he was reading American literature, he began to read them and then reread them and realized that in the 1940s, everybody had the wrong idea of the Puritans. They thought of them as these kind of dark clothing, dour people who never smiled and were just sort of boring, you know, and he realized that's not them at all. And he wrote some books that just changed the game in terms of how the Puritans were understood. He was especially interested. He wrote a book called The New England Mind. I read it when I was doing MA work years ago. And another biography of Jonathan Edwards, which is brilliant, and I read that as well. And some other stuff that he wrote, all just was transformative. So much so that the cousin institution, Yale, didn't want to be left behind because they thought, hey, wait a minute, Jonathan Edwards was supposed to be the president of Yale before he died of a smallpox vaccination. And so they went to work on Jonathan Edwards, and they published what is about a 15-volume set called the Complete Works of Jonathan Edwards. Did you know he wrote that much? 15 volumes. It fills up a whole shelf in the library. I've seen it out at Eastern. Each volume is about that thick. It's filled with his writings, plus, scholarly comment. It's amazing because these are people that don't have any particular interest in the Christian faith. They're just fascinated with the brilliance of his thought. And so they've done all kinds of work. It's been a great kind of wonderful gift to later ages. We Christians should be the first in line to be reading that stuff, but nevertheless, that was a bit of a transformation that preceded Alan Heimert. Then Alan Heimert comes along and takes the progress that had already been made and really ties it to the revolutionary event and says, these things are related. We can connect the dots here, and that's really what he did. So scholars have followed up on Heimert's work, broadened it with significant research in the past 5 decades, right up to the present time. And the evidence has only increased that there's a clear link between the psychological earthquake of the Great Awakening and the political tempest of the Revolution. Did I make it? 2 minutes late. I always want to be done at 10 after 12, and it's 12 after 12. Will you tolerate a short Sunday school lesson? Can I sneak this in here? All right. I gave you at the beginning the statement by the Apostle Paul, the preaching of the cross is power to those who are being saved by it. So just a few thoughts as we wrap up. The preaching of the cross, and that was really at the heart of the Great Awakening. I hope you follow that. That was really what the Great Awakening was about. These were not just lectures, pleasing discourses. This was a powerhouse of preaching, and it wasn't just moving people like a demagogue might. That's where I think Dickey underestimates someone like George Whitefield. More was going on here than just you could, kind of move people by the power of rhetoric. The preaching of the cross transforms people spiritually, effecting regeneration in which a heart of flesh replaces a heart of stone. That was Ezekiel's metaphor, of course. The preaching of the work of Christ changes people in a supernatural way. That's been the Christian conviction down through history. That's why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's like saying I'm ashamed of an M16. Why be ashamed of it? Just pull the trigger. It'll be convincing enough. Just preach the word. It'll be convincing enough. It's the sword that comes out of the mouth of the rider on the horse. It's power, you see. But it's not the power of bazookas and bombs. It's the power of God's Spirit at work in those very simple words. And that was really at the heart of what you'd say happened in the Great Awakening. Out of that, the preaching of the cross transforms people ethically, as a new heart replaces a sense of a higher duty to God than to man. When God changes your heart, He changes your behavior. That's why James says, if a man claims to have faith, but his life doesn't show it, the claim is empty and vapid. If you have faith, people will see it soon enough in the way you live, in the way you talk, in the way you conduct yourself. It'll become evident. Faith changes you. Now, the point we want to get to here, finally, is the preaching of the cross transforms people politically. As a new ethic affirms that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. People think that Jefferson got that from the Enlightenment, The Enlightenment didn't say anything much like that. He did get it from Calvin. He may not have known it, but he did, because that's what Calvin said. That the political systems in this world are of two kinds. Those that acknowledge that there's a God in heaven, and that therefore all that we enjoy as rights and liberties come ultimately from Him, and the task of government is to secure, not to create, but to secure those rights, as Jefferson said. Or the other form is that the highest authority is human, and that government creates rights and destroys them at will based on its own pleasure. It's one or the other. Now, we can have a lot of internal debates on either side of that fence, but that's a fundamental divide politically. I think you all have an instinct for that. And that was really the point of the Great Awakening, was to say that the politics that we are living in trace to a higher source than simply who's carrying the biggest stick at the time. So that hopefully gives us a little sense of the impact of Whitefield, and we'll be picking up from there next time I'm done. Thank you. Nice to have you here. Appreciate your kind attention. Leave if you need to, but I'd love to take a question or two or thoughts or footnotes. Please, Phil.
Whitefield, an Englishman or an American?
No, he was an Englishman. So George Whitefield was born in 1715 roughly, went to Oxford, was ordained in the Anglican Church, and his first trip over here was actually 1738 and 9, and he did a little preaching, but mostly he saw the need for an orphanage in the slave population in the South. People that had, and not just black children, but of all kinds. There had been a lot of tough times. So he went back to England to fundraise, and in fundraising he spoke, and in speaking it was discovered that the guy was this magnificent orator. But he came back to the colonies then to build an orphanage, Bethesda, you know. So he became a kind of honorary American over time, but he was actually English, yeah. Good, thanks. Nope, put you all to sleep. All right, well, thanks, Juice. Thanks so much for coming. Let's have a word of prayer, and I'll let you go. Great and holy God, we are so grateful that you have written history such that it's a fascinating story. And we pray that we can continue to study it and understand it and be the rich beneficiaries of it as we turn around and ask ourselves, now how do we live out great principles that have been championed by those who've gone before in a way that's responsible to you and faithful to your word and of deep service to your people among whom we live at this time in history. We pray that we would do so faithfully as we seek to serve the Lord Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.